Up next, a conversation to understand the term Zionism. What does it mean? What's the history behind it? And what is its relationship to Judaism? Ben Baader is an associate professor in the history department at the University of Manitoba, specializing in European history and Jewish history. Good morning, Ben.
Good morning. Lovely to be here.
Thanks for joining us again. Now, before we get into the definition of Zionism, I think it's really important to understand the historical context that led to the creation of Zionism. What was that context?
Thank you so much. Yes. So, and as a historian, I like starting with history. That's wonderful. But let me actually, as I start with history, start with sort of, if you want the prehistory, really sort of the traditional religious context that is not called Zionism yet, but it's really important for the whole, if you want, phenomenon. So it's really, this is the longing for Zion, the promise of a land is deep, deep, deep in the beginnings of, I mean, Judaism, the Israelite religion, really in the Hebrew Bible, back to Abraham, that in exchange for keeping the terms of the covenant, keeping the mitzvot, keeping the ethical and ritual commandments, the promise of a land, in the biblical terms Canaan, and since the Romans called Palestine. So, and the fascinating thing is that most of you can really say most of the crucial sort of developments in Judaism have happened outside of the land, starting, with God talking to Abraham for the first time, becoming a people in Egypt, the giving of Torah in the desert, the Babylonian Talmud, that is really the crucial piece of founding part of what is Judaism today, all outside of the Holy Land. At the same time, the longing for the land of Israel in Jewish terms is absolutely deeply embedded in Judaism. It is it's hugely crucial to the Jewish religion. It's in the liturgy every day in prayers. That is sort of an important background for us to to keep in mind. Also, this is deeply embedded. This longing for Zion, deeply embedded. But we don't call it quite Zionism yet. Zionism is what we call the modern movement, emerged around 1900, roughly modern secular Zionism. And for that, there were two different contexts. One, Eastern Europe, where you had a large, impoverished Jewish population, part of these multi-ethnic empires, oppressive, particularly the Tsarist government, really oppressive Jewish population, poor, in that context, and national movements. That was a time when the Czechs started to say, we are a nation and we have a Czech language and we should have a state. And the Hungarians and Lithuanians, and sort of this movement of this wave of national movements, emergence of national movements in Eastern Europe, in these multi-ethnic empires. And that's when Jews started to say, we are a nation too. And one needs to understand as a nation, we should have the rights of a nation. So along with at the time, much more the larger modern movement of socialism, Zionism was a sort of an emancipatory response in that sort of emerging of national movements in Eastern Europe. So that is the beginning of modern Zionism in the East. In Western Europe, Jews were a much, much smaller, highly accomplished middle-class population, and and Zionism became a small, really a tiny movement of a few young Jews who were hurt and shocked by the rise of anti-Semitism, especially at the universities. So, and they rejected sort of the integrationist liberal politics of their parents and middle-class Reform Judaism, and basically said, none of this has worked out. We are, it's not going anywhere. They hate us. We need a national movement. And Herzl was one of these young Jews. So, and Herzl's vision of a Jewish state in Palestine, and his diplomatic efforts to find support for such a state happened in a colonial context. It's not controversial, it's not surprising. Around that time, this was really the heyday of colonialism in Europe. and close to every single person in Europe believed in the superiority of Western culture, the right and responsibility to dominate, to civilize the people in Africa, Asia, everywhere else. So this is, if this would, Herzl would have not in line with this, it would have been absolutely surprising. I mean, so it would have been very strange. So, so Herzl very much envisioned the Jewish state in the Middle East, as part of a colonial project. There's no doubt about this. And there's one thing I want to say about this that is important to keep in mind. People can be oppressed or at least disadvantaged and implicated in colonialism at the same time. This is not either or. We just need to think about the Ukrainians who came here to Manitoba, arriving in the same period, in absolutely the same period. They were, I mean, both Jews and Christians. They were impoverished and wanted to get away from the oppressive Tsarist empire. They looked for a better life. And of course, you can say they were victims in the context that they came from. And of course, they were implicated in the colonial project, the British colonial project here. So it's not, people are very often both. And along the same lines, naming this colonial context of the Zionist project does not delegitimize the founding of the state of Israel later. I mean, the same way which it doesn't delegitimize the state of Canada. That was also a colonial project. I mean, and we do know from the Canadian context that to acknowledge the injustice, violence, displacement of Indigenous people on this continent is an important and ultimately healing context for all involved parties. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to catch my breath before I come to the third.
Yes. And you've really kind of laid out a clear backdrop up until that point. So then what's the third kind of part of this historical context that contributed to Zionism?
It's the post-World War II period, the period after the Second World War, and that's when the plot really thickens. So on one hand, it was a time of the worldwide movement of decolonization. People in regions around the world claimed national identities, actually quite similar to what happened in Eastern Europe, sort of 60 years earlier or so. And they started to say we are nations and we have the right to national self-determination, and they often shook off European colonial regimes often in violent confrontations. And that is the context, this sort of national awakening, if you want, of these people around the globe, really, in which also the people in the region of Palestine developed a full-fledged Palestinian identity. So that, again, we have this, another wave of nation building. And at the same time, this was also the time in which the Jewish state was founded in the very same region. In the context, the world was shocked by the Shoah, the Holocaust, this completely unprecedented Nazi extermination project of Jews. And then part of this then, of course, also was a Cold War context, that the state of Israel became sort of the US foothold in the Middle East. And in this time, Zionism became a mainstream movement in a Jewish world. It had been a minority movement, a secular movement, and now things changed. With the stunning military successes in the founding wars, the Israeli army gained international acclaim and admiration. And in general, the world was sort of watched with amazement how this newly founded country built a vibrant and successful society on the ashes of the Holocaust. So it wasn't only okay for Jews now to affiliate themselves with Israel and Zionism, but after the Shoah and after decades of intense anti-Semitism, also in North America and elsewhere, really a traumatized world Jewry took enormous pride in the successes of the Israeli state. Israel became like hugely important for the sense of security of many Jews. At the same time, the Orthodox, the religious establishment and Orthodox Jews turned Zionist, also a very new development after World War II. And many Jews, so it really came to intensely identify with Israel, and often conceived Israel and the identification with the Israeli state and Israeli society as very like a complete part of their religion and their identity as Jews. And so for some also it replaced religion. So a phenomenon that has been called Israelism. So we've talked about this already in our conversation on anti-Semitism, how many Jews experience critique of Israel and Israeli politics as sort of targeting them as Jews.
Deeply linked for some members of the Jewish community,
yes.
Zionism and Judaism. So that's the kind of historical context of Zionism. But let's talk about what the term or the word actually means. What's the definition of Zionism?
Definition of Zionism, in short, the national movement of the Jews. So that is, and as such, it was a modern movement. I mean, before modernity, there were no nations in the current sense. Yeah, that's a definition. But I'd like to talk a little bit more about the character of Zionism. So, and again, as a historian, if we start with the first Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897, it defines Zionism, maybe that's a good place for a definition also, as a movement that, and here I quote, seeks to establish a home for the Jewish people in the land of Israel, secured under public law. So that is the definition of the first Zionist Congress. And they set themselves 4 tasks: the settlement, promoting the settlement of Jewish farmers and laborers. And so what's important here, there was always a small religious community, religious Jewish community in the land of Israel. But now the project was to create a modern society, to have farmers, to plant tomatoes and, vegetables, and have workers, to start to found a sort of a modern society, and not only a religious colony, if you want. Secondly, the goal was to build a network of international Zionist organizations. I mean, and all of these things happened. That was, and thirdly, the strengthening, so that is their language, the strengthening and fostering of Jewish national sentiment and national consciousness. Again, sort of to try to promote the idea that Jews are a nation and not only a religion or an ethnic group. So, and then fourthly, making efforts, their goal was to making efforts to obtain the consent of governments for this project of a modern Jewish settlement in Palestine. And that's, particularly what Herzl did. He approached rulers in Europe and also the Ottoman Empire to conceive, to convince them of the idea of a Jewish state in the region. And Herzl and other Zionists, some other Zionists, many Zionists were quite explicit that what Jews needed was a state. But actually, what we often don't remember, what's often not remembered anymore, is that there have been a variety of different opinions on this in Zionism. So what I like to say, Zionism has always had many different faces, many different, groups under that umbrella. So the program of the Zionist Congress and Herzl, political Zionism. There was also something called multiple movements and organizations that promoted cultural Zionism. So these were Zionists who were most of all interested in a modern, secular Jewish national culture. They did not care about a state, and they mostly supported and pursued the establishment of a cultural center in the region of Palestine. So lots lots of variety, and let me mention just a Zionist group, one of these Zionist groups that was different, from what we think today about, very often about Zionism. That's the organization, the group called Brit Shalom, the Alliance of Peace. that was founded in Palestine in 1925, existed less than 10 years, but it was quite small, but had a number of really sort of leading personalities were part of it. Ahad Am, Judah Magnes, Martin Buber, Hannah Arendt, and more. So for them, Zion was a place of Jewish cultural and spiritual renewal. And they wanted a binational state based on Arab-Jewish cooperation. They were highly critical of Herzl's vision of the Jewish state sort of as a colonial project, as in Herzl's on the rampart of Europe against Asia. And they cried out in despair of the collision between right-wing Zionists and mainstream Zionists and the Palestinians that they saw unfolding at the time. So, when they disbanded in 1933, they were convinced that the region headed into a vicious conflict, and some of them left the country. And and sadly, in retrospect, they saw this coming, what we see today, and that's really something that one can say that step by step in Israel-Palestine and the also pre-state, Palestine, the Yishuv, and we have a development to the right. And that is, in some ways not surprising. You need just a few radicals who do some violent raid, and then you have the counter push, and then you have an escalation, and then sort of building peace and building cooperation is a delicate process that can easily sort of thrown over. So so it's really important to be clear that Netanyahu and his ilk today, this right-wing Zionism that we see today, and the most combative and racist Zionism really is a culmination of a long process where a particular sort of wing of the Zionist movement has been winning. But even today, there's in the city, there are progressive Zionists and Zionists in Israel, herself, who call, for example, for a ceasefire, for the end of violence and occupation in the West Bank, etc. So Zionism is an umbrella with, really a whole different, range of politics.
I think that's really important to remember that within the Zionist movement, there is a range and a spectrum. So thank you for bringing that to our attention. We've had this previous discussion on anti-Semitism, and you've done a very admirable and much appreciated job on explaining the historical context and definition of Zionism. Ben, what are but you have your own reflections and thoughts on this as a historian. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, what I'd like to sort of talk about actually a tiny little bit is something that has very much become part of mainstream Zionism, and is sort of part of the really unfortunate situation today. That is this very well-established concept that Jews have always and everywhere been hated and persecuted. And what's important to say, this is not a historic reality, but a particular interpretation of history, a particular way of telling the story. Yeah, yes, there were times and places where Jewish communities experienced hostility, violence, expulsions, but also long periods of peace, stability, prosperity, forms of integration. So, speaking as a historian, people make choices about how they tell the story and how you tell the story of the Jewish experience. And there is not one true way of telling the story. There are different ways of telling the story. But what is crucial is that the story, the version of we have always been hated and persecuted, is immensely powerful, popular, attractive, and politically dangerous, actually. And it is rooted in Judaism, deeply rooted in Judaism. And it's really, you can say it's a theological principle. It's in the Hebrew Bible. It's Amalek in the Hebrew Bible. Passover Haggadah, in every generation we have been persecuted. That is sort of a refrain in Jewish culture. Then it becomes part of sort of the modern self-understanding in the debates, about of emancipation in the Enlightenment. where it was useful for Jews to say, we have always been persecuted, and now we deserve now to be treated better and to, to have full citizenship. And then more development in the 19th century, and then Zionists, of course, the Zionists. I mean, the core of Zionism is the idea, the belief that we need a Jewish state because we know we are safe. And then in order to promote this Jewish state, we need to promote the ideas that we are always persecuted. So it's a bit of a circle. The bottom line is this was important. This idea of we are always victims and we are always persecuted, and anti-Semitism is sort of this eternal hate against us, was really important in the diaspora. It made sense in the diaspora. It was part of the glue that held the Jewish community together. We are special. We have a special relationship to God. We are, and that's why we're always hated. So it worked well, and it was an important sort of function for survival for a small minority population in the diaspora. But it is, so this Jewish exceptionalism and superiority belong together, but it is not helpful in the Middle East today, in this very, very different setting. And in this context, it is really important that we Jews are clear that we are not only victims, that we have agency and power, and the state of Israel and the Israeli army in the Middle East has power. So maybe just briefly, so for example, as an example, of course, Israelis were victims in the horrific massacres of October 7th. Yes, I mean, however, these massacres were not pogroms, as they're often referred to. These were not riots against an ethnic or religious population without an army. They were assaults against civilians who were citizens of a state with an army, and the state has been involved in a violent, bloody conflict with the non-Jewish population of the area for decades, and the Israeli army failed to protect its citizens. So it's all terrible, but the concept of pogroms is misleading. It evokes, it puts the events into this chain of Jewish eternal and unprovoked victimhood. That is just a problem. So it seems clear to me that in order to get out of the spiral of violence, it's crucial that we get beyond the stance that we are, the Jews and Israel are only victims. So it's important that we reckon with our power, with the colonial context of the Israeli state, with the injustices and violence that we've done to the non-Jews of Palestine, in addition to mourning our own losses and to remembering the violence that was done to us. It is not either or. But the doctrine of Jewish victimhood and the culture of fear and self-righteousness that in right-wing Zionism really is, and that the only way to for us to survive is to have a strong and unforgiving army that, to keep us safe. Has brought us into a cycle of violence in the Middle East that, with this terrible escalation that we see today. So we need to get, that is something we need to leave behind.
Ben, just finally, now that we've had this conversation on anti-Semitism and on Zionism, and you've really, kind of illustrated the deep connection between Zionism for many, many Jews. As a historian, as an academic, as an observant Jew yourself, is it possible to critique Zionism without being anti-Semitic? What's that line, and what should we be mindful of when we try and engage in this kind of conversation or discussion?
Yeah, it's almost impossible to answer. I mean, and it sends us, back to our conversation about anti-Semitism. And as I've explained there, for example, pointing to the colonial context of Zionism is understood as anti-Semitic by many Jews. And it is, and certainly the IRA definition can be read this way. So there's no way of completely winning, sort of. And but perhaps the solution is for both, like for us Jews, as I said, to not only focus on our victimhood, but also to take responsibility for that, our position of colonial power in the Middle East. And for non-Jews, or for the Israeli position of, ours is really complicated, but for non-Jews, to not only focus on Jews as perpetrators of colonial violence, Jews and Israelis, but also consider the fact that Zionism had been an emancipatory movement of an at least disadvantaged Jewish population, and that Jews as a group are also traumatized people. So again, it's not either or. And maybe a piece of practical advice for the end, it is one thing that is completely inappropriate is to force people, because they are Jewish, to condemn Israel or Zionism in private conversation or in public. So like to confront them and sort of make them responsible. So like, do not hold every Jew responsible for the acts of the Israeli state. Also, don't assume that every Jew is a right-wing Zionist. Many Jews are not Zionists at all. And they are progressive Zionists here and in Israel, Palestine, and people, just Jews who have a strong attachment to Israel as the center of Jewish life, but who condemn the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, demand a ceasefire, support Palestinian rights more broadly. So again, Zionism is not one thing, and in many progressive contexts, Zionists and post-Zionists and non-Zionists and anti-Zionists protest together on the street, on Israeli streets against the Netanyahu government, and work together here in Winnipeg to support forces of change in Israel, Palestine.
Ben, so appreciate you coming on the show and sharing your knowledge and your insights with us. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nadia, for having me, and good luck to all of us.